Cato Institute and director at the Cato Institute. He frequently lectures all over the world and has published reviews and articles on politics and morality in scholarly journals. He is the author of Realizing Freedom, Libertarian Theory, History, and Practice, and the editor of The Morality and Capitalism, After the Welfare State, Why Liberty and Peace. Please welcome to the stage Tom Palmer.
Thank you kindly. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you today and to talk about a topic that is a little controversial, and certainly in this presidential election where we've seen candidates, and frankly among both parties, attacking the idea of the market economy, the freedom to trade, the freedom to own property, the freedom to create value in the market. Now, the book that you have there, The Morality of Capitalism, has come out in about 40 other languages, so you could download it in Hindi or Russian if you'd like as well, but we figured English is probably more proper for this audience. Now, one of the things when we think about the term capitalism, people think it's about being immoral, that business people are immoral. Watch television shows, about 40% of the murders on TV shows are committed by business people. Now look at the crime stats, and it's does not correspond. It's about 1/100%. But people see business people as villains. They're greedy. Capitalism makes people selfish. It makes them materialistic. It despoils the environment, and on and on and on. Now that criticism is still ongoing. There's a very interesting book by Michael Sandel from Harvard University, What Money Can't Buy, the Moral Limits of Markets. And he has nothing good to say about the market economy or free enterprise. In the entire book, he says, well, it seems to have been more efficient than communism. And that's it. All the rest of the book, he argues that monetary exchange spoils the good being bought, that there's something wrong about buying and selling things, that it corrupts us, it degrades them, it corrodes human relationships. It's a consistent attack on the market. Well, the first question is free exchange based on greed. Now, greed can be harmful. There's no question about that. I'm not one of those people who say that greed is a good thing. It's not. Greedy people who are not constrained by the rule of law steal from other people. That's why people rob. They want your stuff. They're greedy and they don't respect what you have. They don't respect your rights. But it's a mistake to confuse self-interest with selfishness. Selfishness refers to a disregard for other people. Self-interest is a different matter. You're in school learning because of your self-interest. You want to have better lives. You may be going on to college. Why is that? You're pursuing the interests that you have. These are the interests of selves. But the interests of selves are not limited only to me. My interests encompass my family, my friends, my community, my nation, and so on. But they are my interests, the ones that I pursue. There's nothing wrong with doing that. People who earn money in the market economy so that they can give to charity would be a good example of that. Think about Bill and Melinda Gates. They earned a lot of money, about $55 billion, which is more than I earn in a year. And what are they doing with most of it? They're giving it away to people. They're helping very, very poor people dealing with malaria and diseases that are very uncommon and difficult to attract research funds. Now, they're pursuing their self-interest, but are they being selfish or greedy? I don't think so. The market economy is about pursuing our interests in a way that respects the rights of other people. That is the key element to understand it. In the book that you had there is an essay which I arranged to have translated from Chinese into English by a very great Chinese economist, Professor Mao Yusheng. By the way, Mao is a different name from Chairman Mao, the communist dictator. It looks the same in English, but it's actually a different Chinese name. He's the founder of a think tank, first free market, pro-free enterprise think tank in China, set up in 1978 when China began to open to the world. And he points out that in his essay, imagine a world in which no one pursues their self-interest, but only and exclusively the interest of others. what would that world be like? We're told by people self-interest is bad. He says, imagine a world in which no one pursues their self-interest. Someone walks into a store and picks up an object, this watch. Well, that's nice. How much? And the shopkeeper says $50. And the customer, not wanting his own self-interest or her self-interest, says, no, 50 is too little. I will not pay less than 80. But the shopkeeper, not wanting to pursue his or her own self-interest, but only the interest of the customer, says, no. I will not sell it for more than 30. Absolutely outrageous. I will not pay less than 160. 25. 200. 10. You see a problem. They could never come to an agreement. They could never engage in a mutually satisfactory or mutually beneficial transaction in that world. Only in a world in which the seller wants to get the highest price and the buyer wants to get the lowest price can they come to an agreement that is mutually beneficial, in which each one of them profits, what we call a positive sum game. I'll talk more about that in a moment. The world in which no one is supposed to pursue their self-interest is impossible. It cannot be a moral standard to guide us. What should guide us is pursuing our self-interest, including our wider circle of interests, our families, friends, community, and so on, but constrained by the rule of law and respect for the rights of other people. Now, at the root of opposition to the market is a common view that the gain of one must come at the expense of another. Jean-Baptiste Say, great French economist, and by the way, a friend and correspondent of Thomas Jefferson and many of the American founders, he wrote many letters giving them advice on the American founding, put it very neatly. He says, it's not the case that when you gain, I lose, or when I gain, you lose. The position, each individual is interested in the general prosperity of all. Now, this is important to understand how countries relate. We've heard a presidential candidate say it's outrageous that China is becoming more prosperous. He doesn't understand the basics of trade. If you trade with people, you should want them to be prosperous. It's good for you. Now, there are two elements to this. Wishing ill fortune on other people, wanting other people to suffer, is a sign of bad moral character. We don't want to be people who go through the world wanting other people to be poor. It's also stupid. You want your customers to prosper. They can pay more for your stuff. We should be happy that Canadians are wealthy and prosperous. More trade goes across the U.S.-Canada border than any other border in the world. Huge amount of trade with Canada. And it's better for us in America that Canadians are prosperous. The value of the trade is greater for both sides. Now, if you want to understand the nature of exchange, we can focus on what are called game payoffs or game theory. There's something called a zero-sum game. You may have heard that expression in the past. Oh, that's a zero-sum transaction. What it means is that the sum of the payoffs is zero. So I gain 10, but you lose 10. Add them together, you get 0. 10 plus minus 10 is equal to 0. Many people, in fact, I would even say most people, think that's how the world works. Anytime there's a profit, there had to be a loss for someone else. It's simply not true. These kinds of interactions almost never happen, only on the blackboard. Much more common is what is called a negative sum game, in which the sum of the payoffs is less than 0. Take a simple example. I walk outside tonight, I pass by a dark alley, I'm not paying attention, someone whacks me on the head, maybe hurts me seriously, stabs me, and takes my wallet. I think my wallet has about $60 in it. So let's say that the robber is successful and gets my $60. The robber has 60 and I have minus 60. You'd think that's zero sum. But I'm pretty sure that my hospital bills are going to be another few $100s. Add that in, so let's say I have to pay $400 at the hospital. Now it's a minus 400 is the aggregate payout. Those are pretty common. Every act of robbery, of theft, of rape is a negative sum game. The losses are greater than the benefits to the one who violated rights. And corruption and bribery and cronyism are negative sum games. All the dictators in the world who loot their countries take the value of the stuff they stole, auction it off. It's a tiny fraction of the harm that they cause to their countries. This is well documented over and over and over and over. But there's another kind of transaction that is all around us and most people don't pay any attention to it. It's a positive sum game. The sum of the payoffs is greater than zero. We call this the market economy. We call this free exchange. And there's a little hint that will alert you to when it happens. You go into a store to buy something. So you put down your $4, you get the object, whatever it was that you bought. Now, because you were raised by nice parents who taught you well, you say thank you. And what does the merchant say? Thank you. That's a little weird when you think about it. You get a double thank you. Normally, let's say I were to fall off the stage here, and this young lady, being a very nice young lady, would reach over and help me stand up. I would say thank you, and she would say you're welcome. What if she said, no, thank you? That would be weird, right? That'd be a very weird transaction. Something's wrong about that if she thanks me for the occasion to help me. But every time you buy something voluntarily, you say thank you, and the one who sold it says thank you. That's because you both benefited. And if we want to have free and prosperous societies, we have to have positive sum transactions as the norm. We need to replace these, the negative sum transactions, cronyism, subsidies, handouts, stealing, theft, with positive sum transactions in which both parties gain. And that is what happens in the free market. Now, think about trade. People say, oh my God, trade's terrible. They talk about the trade deficit. They don't understand the fundamentals of international trade. Think about this. Every time you hear the word trade deficit, also hear the words investment surplus. Whenever there's a trade deficit, it means foreigners are investing in our economy. It's the same thing. We buy goods from them. What do they do with those dollars? They either buy goods from us or they buy assets. We call those bonds and shares in companies. So most of the discussion of international trade, I'm afraid to say across the political spectrum, is profoundly ignorant. They do not understand what trade is about. Now imagine, though, you have a great automated factory. Some scientist invents this factory using top-level nanotechnology. And what you can do is in one side, you push things that you can make at low cost. Australians put in sheep, Canadians put in wheat, Americans put in software, Indians put in software, and so on. And then it transformed them into things you can only produce at higher cost, and they come out the other gate. A big factory. So you put in things that are cheap for you to make, and at the other end, out comes things that would be expensive for you to make. What would happen? Everyone would say, this scientist is a great benefactor of humanity. What a wonderful invention to turn cheap things that are easy to make at low cost into things that are costly to make. This person would get Nobel Prize and all kinds of presidential medals until one day we find out it's a fraud. It's not a factory at all. It's a submarine base. And people are bringing in goods. They're taking the goods that are cheap for you to make out of the country and bringing in goods that are expensive for you to make. We call that exchange. That's what exchange is. A farmer finds it relatively low cost to produce tomatoes, I, on the other hand, find producing tomatoes very high cost. What I have to give up is more in value than what I would get. In contrast, the things that I might make, I might work in an automobile factory, or I might produce a different kind of food, or I might be an airline pilot or an airline steward. I produce things that are relatively cheap in exchange for the things that are expensive for me to get, tomatoes. And clothes. I don't make my own clothes. Does anyone here make your own clothes? Nobody. If you'd asked that question 100 years ago, many of the hands would have gone up. Nobody here makes his or her own clothes. I don't make my own shoes. I didn't make my watch. I don't even cut my own hair. I pay people to do that. And we all benefit when we do that. Trade is no different from a machine that takes goods that are cheap for you to produce and turns them into things that are expensive for you to produce. And yet, for some reason, people get angry when people trade. I think it shows a fundamental lack of comprehension of economics. So all that we had there wasn't a factory, it was just free trade. That's what free trade accomplishes for us. Now, if you think about the difference, we can create value in lots of ways. I can take a thing, I can work on it, I can put a lot of time into it, make it more beautiful and more valuable. Or I can trade for something. If I want to buy a painting, I'm not a good painter. I could try to paint it myself, but I guarantee it'll be terrible. I can do what I do better, get money, and buy it from the painter. Think about all the goods and services we buy. They're all the same in that regard. Trade allows you to benefit from the division of labor. Adam Smith put it very neatly in The Wealth of Nations in 1776. The division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. He had the example of a pin factory. One person making pins can make maybe 15 or 20 a day. But when they divide the labor, some of them sharpen, some of them add the little head, some of them extend the wire, you can make hundreds and hundreds a day. He observed this in a pin factory. It was a great insight about what the division of labor does. But what limits the division of labor and the ability for each of our production to increase? It's the extent of the market. But there's one other element. I want to explain this to you, and if you get this, you will know more about economics than most people who've gone through a college econ class. It's called comparative advantage. It's one of the most important principles in the whole world, and not many people understand it. David Ricardo was a British economist, and he explained, under a system of perfectly free commerce, each country naturally devotes its capital and labor to such employments as are most beneficial to each. This pursuit of individual advantage is admirably connected with the universal good of the whole. By stimulating industry, rewarding ingenuity, by using efficaciously the peculiar powers bestowed by nature, it distributes labor most effectively and most economically. While by increasing the general mass of productions, it diffuses general benefit and binds together by one common tie of interest and intercourse the universal society of nations throughout the civilized world. It was one of the greatest discoveries of the human mind. It's why we buy bananas from Honduras. You can grow bananas in Massachusetts, by the way, in a hothouse. It's very difficult to do, but you can do it. You can grow bananas in North Dakota. But every banana you grow means you give up something else of much greater value. What grows very well in Minnesota? Not bananas, but apples do. They grow a lot of apples. They don't grow very many apples in Honduras. Too hot. There's no frost. So we buy our bananas from Honduras, where it's inexpensive for them to produce, and they buy their apples from us. That's a win-win situation. Let's look at the mathematics of it. I'm going to give you a simple example of comparative advantage using two people, Mary and myself, Tom Palmer. And what I want to show you is that through specialization, division of labor, through trade, you can consume more than you can produce. It's a very important principle in economics. It took thousands of years for people to work it out, but it's very deep and important. If you don't get this, you don't understand the modern world. So let's imagine we have an economy with two goods, apples and fish, simple economy. And now we have two people, Mary and Tom. Mary has an absolute advantage in production of both, and this is the key distinction. There's absolute advantage and comparative advantage, and people confuse them all the time. You can spend a whole course in econ learning just this one point, but I'll give it to you in the most basic terms. If Tom only catches apples, he can gather 50. If he only catches fish, he can get 50. But in the same time, Mary can get 100 fish or 200 apples. She's better at both. She's a superstar. Tom is what is called in economics a loser. He's not good at anything. So why would Mary want to trade with Tom? He's weak, he's insignificant. What's the benefit to her? Well, let's look at it. Imagine we have production in isolation. And both of them had mothers who taught them to have a balanced diet. Not all fish, not all apples, but half and half, fish and apples. So Tom specializes, he goes from 50 to 25 and 50 to 25. He gets 25 fish and 25 apples for his labor. Mary gets 50 fish, but 100 apples. Remember, she could have gotten 100 fish if she spent all day doing that, or 200 apples. Makes sense. Nothing surprising about this. The numerical ratios are constant. Now, Mary's pretty smart. She's smarter than Tom. She's better at picking apples and better at catching fish, and she's smarter. She comes to Tom, she says, I'll tell you what, I'll give you 37 apples for 25 fish. Tom thinks about it. He's not very bright. He says, okay, I'll do that. So he goes from 25 apples down to 0, and from 25 apples up to 50. Mary goes from 50 apples down to 25. She reduces by 50% of the amount of time allocated. And she goes from 100 apples to 150. Again, the numerical ratios are constant. There's nothing surprising. There's no tricks in this. Very simple, simple arithmetic. Now they trade. What happens? Right? Well, Tom had 50. He gives 25 over. Mary had 25. Now she has 50. That's the same as before trade. But look at this. Mary had 150. She takes 37 and gives them to Tom. Tom now has 37. That's 12 more than he would have had if he did not trade. And Mary has 13 more than she would have had if she did not trade. That's kind of weird. That's why it took people a long time to work this out. And David Ricardo did it by studying the trade of wool and wine between England and Portugal. They make very good wool in England because it rains all the time and it's cold. And they make very good wine in Portugal. And trust me, you do not want to try English wine. So they traded. And he studied this and he figured out what was going on. Now, it's not a mystery. It's comparative advantage at work. Despite being less productive than Mary at everything, Tom has no absolute advantage. He's the lowest cost producer of fish. Because remember, Tom can produce 50 fish or 50 apples. That means one fish costs him one apple. But Mary, she can produce 100 fish or 200 apples. What does it mean? The cost of one fish for Mary is 2 apples, double the cost of production for Tom. Cost is what you give up when you get something. Her cost of production is double Tom's. When they specialize and engage in trade, they're both better off. If you understand this, you will understand more about international economics than most of the people who talk about it on television, who are astonishingly ignorant and ill-informed. It pays to learn economics and figure out how the world works. Now, it has another benefit. This is a friend of mine, Chris Roofer. You have done business with Chris, I'm sure, but you didn't know it. He's probably the largest tomato processor in America. He started out with a pickup truck, moving around tomatoes and peaches and other fruit, and he figured out how to process them at lower cost. He'd go into the factories, he'd say, look at all those steps, I could cut 4 of those steps up and shorten it. We can produce those tomatoes and get them to the market faster. So he exports all over the world. What is he doing? He's creating peace also. Not only the pizza topping that you had and the spaghetti sauce, someone made that, and there's a pretty good chance he was involved in it, but is also he's creating peace. When you see other people as customers, it doesn't really occur to you to want to shoot them or hurt them. Trade is a beautiful alternative to violence and coercion. You don't take stuff from other people, you offer them something in exchange. He's creating friendship and peace all over the planet. And the evidence is very robust from econometric studies and empirical studies that trade creates peace. Even the volume of trade between countries reduces the likelihood of violence. One of the things we should be very grateful about is having Canada to our north, 4,000 miles of undefended border, and a lot of nice people on the other side. We do a huge amount of trade with them, and that has helped to keep the peace since 1812 between the United States and Canada. The same is true around the world. The first Nobel Peace Prize winner, Frédéric Passy, put it very neatly. So-called protectionism, or trade restrictions, creates enemies. And we see this in history over and over and over. Countries that begin to build these walls, these tariff barriers, these obstacles to trade, are much more likely to go to war afterwards. Protectionism, and it's a bad term, you're not protecting anyone other than special interests. Trade barriers precede war. The evidence is simply overwhelming. Oops, go back to that. There's a book I produced on the topic, Peace, Love, and Liberty. Has a great deal of data. If you're interested in getting it, you can order it, or you can even find the whole PDF online. You can use it in your school papers and so on. I have a great deal of data from leading political scientists. Now, the alternative, what is the alternative to free markets? Socialism, real socialism? Not even Bernie Sanders supporters believe that. When you ask them, when they say we're for socialism, you say, what does it mean? Oh, people should be nice and things should be free. Okay, whatever. That's not socialism as it was understood in the 20th century, when the state owned the means of production. Every factory, every store, every building was owned by the state, and they tried to plan the economy. No serious person really wants that again. It failed. The real alternative is called cronyism. It's an interesting term. It comes from the Greek chronios, means long term. The same root as chronology and other words like that. It's about time. The old buddies of the people in power. And what it means is that they give stuff to their friends. That's cronyism. To their business partners, their golfing partners, their family members. Go to very corrupt countries and you find it's very good to be in the family of the president. You get a lot of stuff at the expense of other people. In the Philippines, when I was there many years ago, they had a dictator named Ferdinand Marcos and his wife Imelda. They were very famous. They were extraordinarily corrupt. And Imelda had a house for her shoes. She had 5,000 pairs of shoes. Kind of weird. But that's what she spent the money on that they had robbed the people of. But people in the Philippines, middle-class people, said, you know, we didn't care about the shoes that much. What we objected to was the mining operations of the Marcos family and their friends. Mining operations? What mining operations? Are there any mines in the Philippines? Oh, they would go along with the police and say, this is mine, this is mine, this is mine, and this is mine. They'd steal everything. You have something they like, take it away. That's cronyism. It's done in a more subtle way in the United States. You get government subsidies, government handouts, government loans. But at base, it's no different. Now, when you think about free market capitalism, it has made a big difference in how human beings live. The Danish economic historian Angus Madison charted per capita income around the world from the year 1, There's no year zero, by the way, but from the year 1 of the modern era up until roughly the time of his death a few years ago. You'll notice the line is pretty flat. Doesn't move. There's a tiny bump. See, it starts about 1200, goes to about 1600, a little bit after. What's called the High Middle Ages in Europe, the growth of commerce and cities again, and the southern India trade and the southern Sung dynasty, which was very business-oriented. It collapses here, what's called the general crisis of the 17th century, because of wars all across Europe and Asia. The so-called 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648 was a catastrophe for Europe. It killed huge numbers of people. But then it starts to take off. Something happens right around here. Something quite remarkable. And per capita income becomes virtually vertical. Some places later than others, and to a lesser extent. This world is a complete transformation. Don't believe people say it was always better in the past. It wasn't. It simply wasn't. It wasn't even in my lifetime better in terms of your economic well-being. The poorest people in America today can get dental care better than the richest could get 30 years ago. The richest people in America got poorer quality dental care than the poorest people can get right now. Imagine you had an experiment, a science fiction experiment, some time warp opens up. And you have George Washington, who lives just before this happens, and Julius Caesar, who dies just right about here. And Washington says to Julius Caesar, come have dinner with me at my home. Julius Caesar would recognize that world. That'd be some weird, different things, sure. But he would get the message hand-delivered on a piece of parchment or paper. Say, please come have dinner on a certain day and time. He would travel on a horse, then in a boat, either powered by human labor or by the wind. He'd travel on a horse again. They would have dinner by candlelight, and the food was cooked by slaves. He'd say, gee, not much change. I recognize this world. Now move forward a little bit. Here. He gets a message by telegraph, travels on a steamship. After landing, gets in a train. Move forward a little bit. There's no slaves. Slavery is eliminated for the first time in all of human history. Move forward a little bit more. They dine by candlelight. Not by candlelight, pardon me, by electrical light. A little bit further, he flies there through the air. It could go on. Today, he'd get a tweet and they would have dinner over Skype. Our world is completely incomprehensible to almost all generations of human beings who've ever lived. Something changed. It was the growth of trade, entrepreneurship, and free market capitalism. And it still makes a difference. The Fraser Institute of Canada, with the Cato Institute here in Washington, produces an annual study called the Economic Freedom of the World Report. And they rate all the countries in the world by the degree to which their economies are free. Now, they have different criteria. These are all publicly available. If you want to visit the site, freetheworld.com, all the data can be downloaded. If you're a statistician or a computer programmer, you can add it to other data sets. It's a totally open source, transparent project. They measure all these different elements, 24 components, 42 distinct variables, and then rank all the countries of the world. Here they're ranked by quartiles, 25%, 25%, and so on, all the way from Hong Kong, #1, down to Venezuela at the moment, number 157. If you've noticed in Venezuela, an example, one of the few, of real socialism, they now have just introduced forced labor to force people under compulsion to work on farms. Going from one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America to forced labor and hunger and starvation. Astonishing, a horror and a warning to the world. But let's look at what you can do when you take these quartiles. First point is per capita income is robustly correlated. This is average per capita income among those 25% in each quartile. Now, it could be, you should learn something in statistics is very important. Correlation is not the same as causation. Two things may be correlated, it does not follow one causes the other. But it could be countries become very rich and then say, let's have economic freedom. But that's actually a very simple statistical test to run. That does not happen. Poor countries adopt policies of economic freedom and become wealthy. And we have seen that in my lifetime. South Korea is one of the best examples, from deep, deep poverty to one of the wealthier countries in the world. Economic growth is correlated, not as robustly. This is a bit more complicated to measure economic growth, but those differentials do add up. It might not look like a lot. 1% a year is not a big deal. But countries that grow at those different rates will separate out pretty rapidly. That's why interest rates and things like mortgages and bank accounts do matter. You want to pay attention to them because over time, it adds up. Now, this is rather interesting. People say the rich get richer, the poor get poorer under capitalism. You hear that all the time. They said, is it true? So they went out and they looked at the 10% the lowest 10% of earners in the population, the poorest people. What share of the total gross domestic product, the total national wealth produced, did they get? And what's interesting is about 2.5%. It bumps around every year just a little bit. No way to predict that, but we know it's about 2.5%. That was a puzzle. Why was that? We're not sure. But this is also quite striking. What is the income of those people? The average of the lowest 10% in the least free countries, $1,629, up to just under $10,000. Put it this way. If you're going to be a very poor person, and someone's in the lowest 10%, that's what an income distribution means, you can't all be in the upper 1% or the upper 10%. Everyone understands that. Not everyone can be above average. If you're going to be in that poorest group, it's much better to be poor in Switzerland than in Swaziland. What does it mean to be poor in Swaziland? It means you do not have access to clean drinking water. You are illiterate. You probably cannot afford eyeglasses. You have no dental care. And you are likely to hold your baby in your arms as your baby dies because of diarrhea, dehydration, something that is solved by a tiny amount of money in wealthy countries. What does it mean to be poor in Switzerland, in contrast? It means you do not have an iPhone or an iPad. Oh, I'm sorry. I do have an iPhone, but I do not consider that staggering poverty. That's the difference between economic freedom and lack of economic freedom. Poverty is watching your children die in your arms or not having an iPhone. We can look at life expectancy. This has been narrowing. It's been rising in the least free countries quite rapidly because drugs are sent to them. So that gap is narrowing. It's still 17 years between the least and the most on average. Think about that, 17 years of life. If I were to offer you two things, either an all-expense-paid trip around the world, flying business class, or you can live 17 more years, which sounds more attractive? The business class, obviously. Most people, it's the 17 years. It means you can meet your grandchildren and actually talk to them. Maybe your great-grandchildren. That's what the gift of economic freedom is. Now, this is an interesting one. Different kinds of freedom. Civil freedom, the right to worship as you choose, the right to talk to people you want to, the right to freedom of speech. Political freedom, the right to contest elections, to vote for different candidates, not to be ruled by a dictatorship, and economic freedom. They're very strongly correlated with economic freedom, but we don't know exactly in what ways. This deserves a lot more study. So any future graduate students and PhD candidates, this is a most interesting question. Does greater economic freedom cause greater political freedom? There are lots of stories where we can tell that story, but there are some stories, like India, where greater political freedom led to greater economic freedom. All we know is that there's a strong connection between the two. It's not easy to know which way the causation goes. Now, the world overall has been getting freer economically since 1980 when they started measuring these. It took a little dip in 2008, 2009, and then came back up just a little bit. And the United States also, unfortunately, falling in the last number of years. The U.S. has been falling in the rankings from, I think it was about 6 down to under 11, under both the Bush and Obama administrations. We've seen some diminution in economic freedom in this country. The U.S. rankings fell in all 5 areas, most radically in property rights. So let me conclude, so we'll have some time for discussion, because I'm interested in your thoughts also. If you want to have a positive sum society, a society in which people benefit each other, which is the foundation for cooperative, peaceful order, you really need to embrace, understand, defend, and even celebrate free market capitalism. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to hear your thoughts as well. Anyone like to pose a problem? I don't like to say ask a question because I may not know the answer to it. I don't want to presume that I do. But if you have some thoughts. Yes, sir. I think it was stealing from you and other people. It was grossly unfair. If you make a product and other people don't want to buy it, you should go out of business. And that's a very important part of a market economy. There's profits from adding value, but when you subtract value, you make losses. And those two signals tell us how to change our behavior. If you're adding a lot of value, the market says, do more of that. People like it. If you're subtracting value, the market's telling you, don't do that anymore. You're losing money. And it puts a limit to how much you can lose. When the state comes in and disrupts that, what we have increasingly is a very different system. Private benefits and public losses. That's what happened in this case. It makes people engage in far more risky behavior, which is what happened with banks. They said, well, if it collapses, the taxpayers will pick up the bill. But if it turns out okay, I'll be really rich. That's sending all the wrong signals. So in my opinion, firms should be allowed to fail. And let me add one more thing about that. We were lied to by very important politicians about that, on that. Number one, they said, oh my God, if they go into bankruptcy, let's say the automobile manufacturer, look at all the jobs. They misled us on what bankruptcy means. That's a very important point. Bankruptcy means that the firm is not able to meet its obligations. It has debts and so on. It doesn't have the resources to do that. Under such a circumstance, what happens to the company? It doesn't just go and disappear. It's reorganized under Chapter 11 of the Bankruptcy Act, which means that the board of directors and the shareholders, let me correct, the shareholders no longer elect the board of directors. So if you're a shareholder in the company, you invested hoping it would yield a positive return. It didn't. You picked the wrong managers, so you lose the value of your shares. And instead, the creditors, the people to whom money is owed, the people who advanced or loaned money, they become, in effect, the owners. And they elect a different board of directors and fire all the people who screwed up the company. So you would have had a couple of hundred people fired, managers, in the case of General Motors, people who thought they were in the finance business rather than making cars. They made cars people didn't want to buy. Those people should have lost their jobs. But the company would have been reorganized and continued doing something in a different way. We were misled about that. What happened instead? The government came in and bailed out the shareholders and stiffed the creditors, made them take what's called a haircut. It was illegal, arguably unconstitutional because it was on interference with contract, which is prohibited in the Constitution. It really was outrageous in my opinion. And it was a big handout to a very important constituency, the unions, who ended up doing very well out of that deal, the United Automakers Union. So I think it was wrong. The second thing was the TARP program. Secretary of the Treasury came out and said, oh my God, if you don't give us the money to do this, it's a Great Depression, it'll happen, it'll be worse than 1930s. This is what we're going to do with the money. They allocated the money in Congress, and they did not do that with the money. They did other things with it. Well, this is highly misleading. In my opinion, firms should be allowed to fail. If they don't add value, they go out of business. Too bad. Rather than making the taxpayers pick it up. Yes, sir. There are two kinds of bankruptcy at stake here, if everyone heard. So I mentioned General Motors or various companies going bankrupt. What about when a state or a political entity, Detroit or county, goes bankrupt? Those are actually different in law, and they have a very different impact. So bankruptcy for private firms should be a normal part of the market economy. You don't add value, you go out of business, do something else. And those assets, that capital, will be reallocated to something that creates value. But what about when a monopoly political institution like Illinois, which has a monopoly jurisdiction over this territory, basically says, we borrowed so much money we can't pay it back? Well, they cannot have an unlimited claim on the assets of the taxpayers and go and just like go into your house and take all your furniture out and sell it outside of the state to be able to pay the creditors. In those cases, basically, it's default. And default is better, but I should point out, it's not something that should be welcomed. And this is why actually it was shocking when Donald Trump thought the United States was like one of the companies he owned. That's how he thinks about the world. He's buying the United States, and he'll own it. And he said, I'm the king of debt. The U.S. has a lot of debt, we'll just default on it. Excuse me? It's not the same. That was really shocking. A very shocking, irresponsible thing to say. The United States government has obligations that may end up in a default at some point because they're adding debt on top of debt on top of debt and the unfunded liabilities. But to cavalierly suggest that, I think, is extremely irresponsible. And suggested his mentality is he's buying the country rather than being elected to an office of the presidency. I found disturbing. Over here. Did everyone hear that? That's a very profound question. May I restate it and correct me if I make an error? But Milton Friedman had argued that the benefits of free market capitalism come to the most humble people, the ordinary people. But a lot of people don't understand that. They don't think that's the case. How do we explain it to them? And it is not an easy thing to do because people look around themselves and they assume everything is like that. Now, I live part of the year most of the year I'm outside of the U.S., so I don't spend much time in the U.S. And a lot of my time is in very poor countries. And I married into a family. I was shocked by how poor they were. No running water, no electricity. They're used to it, but life is difficult in those circumstances. So now my mother-in-law, because by their standards in that country, I'm extremely rich. I'm like a multimillionaire. In America, I'm comfortable. I don't complain. But in that society, I'm staggeringly wealthy. So now they have a house. We've just built a kitchen, a proper, nice kitchen with a sink. She never had a sink. She has a washing machine. And they have electricity. And because I visit, I did insist on air conditioning because I find it unbearable to be in tropical countries without it. They've never had it. Most people don't comprehend that that's what it's like for much of the world. And they think their grandparents lived just like they live today. How to explain that's not the case? Well, you can look at economic data and statistics, you can show them charts like the one I showed, but what does it mean? People don't get it. They don't see that the living standard is different. I think that one of the things that we can do, though, is to explain what it means to be poor in other countries. And I tried to give that with a story of what it means to be poor in Swaziland. Hold your own baby as your baby's life ebbs away. It's an unbearable thought. Certainly for anyone who's a parent, it's unbearable. But other people have to deal with this regularly, from things that no one has ever died from in our country. What you need to do to explain it is to be imaginative and try to create images of what it's really like. Last point. I talk to people in universities who do not believe what is happening in Venezuela. It can't be true. It can't be true. The people are hungry. They are desperate. When there's a word that there's a truck of pasta, spaghetti, driving on a highway, it's ambushed. And the spaghetti is stolen. Can you imagine that life, that world? This is what has been done in a formerly wealthy country by socialism. But I'll leave it to your imagination to how to explain it. There's someone over here. Any hands on this side here? Is there one back here? Okay. This is the chatty side. So yes, ma'am. The question was about Wall Street or finance and housing markets and what changes would I make since those in 2008. That the first point would be I would have gotten rid of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac beforehand. These government agencies, as they're called government-sponsored enterprises, were very substantially responsible for the financial crisis. What they did was they pushed out low-cost loans. It started under the Clinton administration, but continued under the Bush administration. It was a bipartisan act of stupidity, in my opinion. Here's what they said. Everyone should own a home. Everyone should have a house. Do you have a house, your own house in your own name? You should have one. Why not? And the reason you don't have it is because you don't have credit, right? We'll make credit easy. So what they did was they generated massive government lines of credit. These are not private companies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They're government-sponsored enterprises with a line of credit from the United States Treasury. And they offered easy loans. So it used to be traditionally there was a 20% down payment. That was for about 60 years. You want to buy a house for $200,000, you have to save $60,000, a lot of money, put it down, then you take out a 30-year or 15 or 20 whatever year loan you're paying every month. It means if you default on the loan, you lose your $60,000. That's a big incentive for you to really be focused, to earn money and pay your mortgage. Well, they lowered that down to 3%. Now on your $200,000 home, instead of a 20%, sorry, that would have been $40,000 down on a $200,000 home, now it's only $6,000. So the penalty to you of just walking away and not paying your mortgage goes from 40 to 6. That's a $34,000 difference. And just before the financial crisis, the Bush administration announced new government program, 0% down payment. 0%. And money was pushed towards what were called lower qualified borrowers, which, by the way, is all of you. You're very young, you don't have credit records, and probably not a lot of savings at this point in your life. But there were college students who bought houses on what were called ninja loans, government-subsidized ninja loans. Ninja stands for no income, no job or assets. It meant you were paying rent for your 4 years of college, after which you could sell the house, and because housing prices kept going up, you made a profit and you went to Hawaii. Great. Until the housing bubble bursts. And we ended up with a very serious financial crisis. So I would have stopped all of that. And I would stop it now because they started it again. and we will see another housing bubble in the future. Yeah. They keep pumping these bubbles up. Everyone feels good. Values are going up, my stock portfolio, and so on, until it collapses. And then who's to blame? Yes, sir. I think we got time for maybe two more. But if it were true, unemployment would be 80% in this country, but it's not. And the key thing to understand, this is why Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are both equally ignorant about trade. People buy stuff from you. What do they buy it with? They send you stuff in exchange, or they buy assets. If you buy stuff from them, what do you buy it with? Assets or goods? In some important sense, trade is always in balance. When you include the capital account, it's always in balance. It turns out foreigners are not so dumb as to send us stuff for free. What did they want? But they're not. They want something in exchange. If they send us something, they want something back. So you hear people, ignorant people, say, the U.S. doesn't export anything. U.S. exports are at a record high. What does the United States export? Lots of stuff. Heavy machinery, Boeing, airplanes. They don't make a lot of airplanes in Nepal, but they buy them. Where do they buy them from? A lot of them come from the United States. Another way to think of it is there's something called the Lerner symmetry thesis in international trade. It's a fancy way of saying a tax on imports that makes it more difficult to import has the same impact as a tax on exports. If you make it more difficult to import, you make it more difficult to export. So every time someone says, we're going to protect this industry that's competing against imports, what they're saying is, we're going to hurt that industry that's exporting. It's exactly the same statement. You cannot have a situation in which you're exporting without importing, right? Because that would be dumb also. Right? Just give away your stuff for free. You should get something in exchange. NAFTA has not had the negative impacts that they say about it. I'm not a huge fan of NAFTA, CAFTA, and so on. They're not perfect in my opinion, but they're much better than not having them. And they added a huge amount of value and growing incomes in the United States, all across the income distribution, all across it. Mr. Trump proposed a 45% tariff on Chinese goods, a 35% tariff on Mexican goods. He hasn't mentioned Canada. I think I know why. They look white, and I think that's the difference. But Mexicans and Chinese hit them with 45 and 35% tariffs. And when people said, can you think of the trade war? What would this do with U.S. exports? He says, I'm not afraid of a trade war. Well, I am. It would crash the world economy, and we would see a massive economic collapse in this country. It would take years to recover from it. And I should point out one more thing. If he did it, who would be blamed for this for the next 80 years? The Republican Party, which is why a lot of Republicans are not too happy with Mr. Trump and not pleased is at the top of the ticket. But I think I'm out of time, and I do not want to overstay. And I'll add one more thing. My views on the presidential election are my personal views. You can make up your own minds as to how you want to vote if you're of voting age. That was not the main point. Main point was to talk about the benefits of free exchange. And I thank you very much for your attention.